There's a god who was torn apart while still in the womb, stitched into his father's thigh, driven mad by a jealous goddess, and yet somehow became the most beloved deity in ancient Greece. A god whose festivals were so wild, so intoxicating, that the Roman Senate once tried to ban them entirely, executing thousands of his followers in a single night. A god who was worshipped by kings and slaves alike, by philosophers and madmen, by women who left their homes in the dead of night to dance in the mountains until dawn. His name was Dionysus, and his story is nothing like what you've been told. We think we know him, the party god, the wine guy, the one who shows up in mythology textbooks as a footnote, a minor deity obsessed with grapes and good times. But that's not who Dionysus was at all. He was something far more dangerous, far more necessary, and far more human than any other god in the Greek pantheon. He was the god of everything civilized society tries to suppress, the force that reminds us we're not just minds living in orderly cities, but bodies filled with chaos, desire, and wildness that no amount of rules can contain. And here's what makes his story so haunting. Dionysus is the only major Greek god who died. Not metaphorically, he was murdered, butchered into pieces while still a child, and then resurrected. He walked between life and death, sanity and madness, the human and the divine. He knew what it meant to suffer, to be torn apart, to lose yourself completely. And that's precisely why the Greeks loved him. Because Dionysus didn't promise them perfection or order or rational control over their lives. He promised them the one thing every human being secretly craves, the freedom to let go. Let's start at the beginning, though the beginning with Dionysus is never quite where you expect. His mother was Semele, a mortal princess of Thebes, beautiful and young, caught in the worst possible situation, having an affair with Zeus, the king of the gods. Now, Zeus was many things. Powerful, strategic, but subtle was not one of them. And his wife Hera knew about every single one of his affairs. She always knew. But with Semele, Hera didn't just want revenge, she wanted obliteration. So Hera disguised herself as an old woman, a trusted nurse, and whispered poison into Semele's ear. "You say your lover is Zeus? Prove it! Make him reveal himself in his true divine form. Any god could claim to be Zeus, but the real Zeus, the true king of Olympus, would show you his glory." And Semele, pregnant and young and desperately in love, believed her. She asked Zeus to grant her one wish, any wish, and made him swear on the river Styx, an oath that even gods cannot break. Then she asked him to appear before her as he truly was. Zeus knew immediately what would happen. He begged her to ask for anything else, but he'd sworn the oath, and when a god reveals their true form to a mortal, the mortal burns. Not metaphorically. The divine radiance is too much for human flesh to contain. Semele died instantly, consumed by lightning and fire, her body disintegrating. But she was 6 months pregnant, and in those final seconds as she burned, Zeus reached into the flames and pulled out the fetus, the child who would become Dionysus, and did something no god had ever done before. He cut open his own thigh and stitched the baby inside, carrying him to term in his own body. Think about what this means. Dionysus was born twice. First from his mother in fire and death and tragedy. Then from his father in an act so bizarre, so contrary to nature that it marked him forever as different. He was the god born from death, the god who survived when he shouldn't have, the god who existed in the space between categories. Not fully Olympian because his mother was mortal, not fully mortal because his father was Zeus. Born from a woman, but also from a man. He was liminal from the very start, existing in thresholds, in the places where one thing becomes another. And Hera still wasn't finished. Even after Semele's death, even after this impossible birth, she wanted the child destroyed. So she sent the Titans, the ancient chaotic forces that preceded the Olympian gods, to find the infant Dionysus. They found him playing with toys, mirrors, and knucklebones, innocent and unaware, and they tore him to pieces, literally ripped him apart, limb from limb, then boiled the pieces in a cauldron. This wasn't just murder, this was annihilation, an attempt to erase him so completely that not even the gods could bring him back. But Dionysus's grandmother, Rhea, the mother of Zeus herself, gathered the pieces and put him back together. He was resurrected, reborn again, for the third time now. And this death and resurrection, this experience of being torn apart and remade, became the central mystery of his worship. Because Dionysus knew something the other gods didn't. He knew what it felt like to be destroyed. He knew dissolution, chaos, the terror of losing yourself completely. And he knew that sometimes you have to fall apart to be remade into something truer. After his resurrection, Zeus gave Dionysus to the nymphs of Mount Nysa to raise in secret, hidden from Hera's sight. He grew up far from Olympus, far from civilization, in the wild mountains among creatures who lived by instinct and desire rather than law and order. And when he came of age, Hera finally found him. But this time, she didn't try to kill him, she did something worse. She drove him mad. Divine madness, the Greeks called it. Not the madness of disease or confusion, but the madness that comes when you see too much truth at once, when the boundaries of your identity dissolve and you can no longer tell where you end and the world begins. Dionysus wandered the earth raving, lost in visions, unable to hold himself together. He traveled through Egypt, through Syria, through Phrygia, and eventually to India, and everywhere he went, he taught people something strange. He taught them how to cultivate the vine, how to make wine. But more than that, he taught them how to lose themselves. How to dance until exhaustion, how to drink until the rational mind released its grip, how to enter ecstatic states where you became something more or less than human. And slowly, through this wandering, through sharing his madness with others, Dionysus began to heal. Because here's the thing about his madness. It wasn't just a curse, it was a gift in disguise. It was the ability to step outside yourself, to break free from the rigid boundaries of identity that keep us trapped. The Greeks understood something we've forgotten, that sanity, when it becomes too rigid, too controlled, is its own form of prison. Sometimes you need to go mad to become whole. When Dionysus returned to Greece, he wasn't returning as a victim or a wounded god. He was returning as a conqueror. Not with armies, but with something far more powerful, with liberation. And the first city he came to was his birthplace, Thebes, the city where his mother had died, where his family had rejected him before he was even born. Because Semele's own sisters had spread rumors that she'd lied about Zeus, that she'd invented the whole affair to cover up a mortal pregnancy, and that her death by lightning was divine punishment for blasphemy. Thebes was now ruled by Pentheus, Dionysus's cousin, a young king who believed in order, rationality, and control above all else. When Dionysus arrived with his followers, women who called themselves Maenads or Bacchae, wild devotees who danced with abandon and claimed to be possessed by the god himself, Pentheus was horrified. He saw chaos. He saw the breakdown of social order, women abandoning their households, citizens losing control of themselves. He saw everything he feared most. So he tried to ban the worship of Dionysus entirely, to arrest the god himself, not knowing who he was. This story is told in Euripides' play, The Bacchae, one of the most unsettling dramas ever written. Because Dionysus, calm and smiling, allowed himself to be arrested. He let Pentheus chain him, imprison him, think he'd won. And then, without violence, without force, he simply convinced Pentheus to do the one thing that would destroy him: to go into the mountains disguised as a woman, to spy on the Maenads, to see what they did in their rituals, to try to understand what he'd been fighting. Pentheus agreed. He put on women's clothing, he let Dionysus adjust his hair, his dress, and he climbed into the mountains. But the moment he arrived, the Maenads saw him. Or rather, they saw what Dionysus wanted them to see: a wild beast, a lion threatening their sacred space. And in their ecstatic frenzy, they tore him apart with their bare hands, led by his own mother, Agave, who didn't recognize her son, who held his severed head high, thinking it was a hunting trophy. Only when the madness faded did she realize what she'd done, that she'd murdered her own child in ecstatic frenzy. It's a horror story, but it's also a warning, because Pentheus represents everything we try to be: controlled, rational, orderly. He represents the part of us that thinks we can suppress the chaos inside us through sheer willpower, through rules and laws and rigid boundaries. And Dionysus shows us what happens when that suppression becomes too complete. The chaos doesn't disappear, it just waits, and when it finally breaks through, it's catastrophic. After Thebes, city after city across Greece accepted Dionysus, not because they wanted to, but because they had to, because the alternative was worse. And his worship spread like wildfire, not among philosophers or kings, but among the people who needed him most. Women trapped in domestic servitude, slaves who had no freedom, farmers who knew the hard reality of life and death in the soil. Dionysus offered them something no other god could. Not transcendence, not escape to some perfect heavenly realm, but immersion. The chance to dive so deep into physical experience, into their bodies, into the present moment, that they touched something divine. His festivals, the Dionysia, became the most important celebrations in ancient Athens. For days, the entire city would shut down. Social hierarchies dissolved. Slaves drank alongside their masters. Women left their homes and joined processions through the streets. And at the center of it all was theater, because Dionysus was the god of theater too. Every Greek tragedy and comedy was performed in his honor, in his temple, as a form of worship. Because theater, like wine, like madness, allows you to step outside yourself, to become someone else for a while, to feel things you normally suppress. Think about what the Greeks understood here. They built their greatest art form, the very foundation of Western drama, around the worship of chaos and transformation. They knew to be fully human, you needed both Apollo and Dionysus, both order and chaos, both rational thought and ecstatic experience. You couldn't have one without the other. A society that's all Apollo, all reason and control, becomes sterile, rigid, eventually tyrannical. But a society that's all Dionysus, all chaos and impulse, destroys itself. You need both. You need the tension between them. The Roman historian Livy recorded what happened when Rome first encountered Dionysian worship, which they called the cult of Bacchus. The Bacchanalia, as the festivals were known, had spread from Greece into Italy, and Roman authorities were terrified. They saw secret nocturnal meetings, sexual freedom, social boundaries breaking down, and they responded with brutal force. In 186 BCE, the Roman Senate passed the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus, effectively banning Bacchic worship throughout Italy. They arrested thousands of followers and executed them, destroyed temples, burned sacred texts. It was one of the earliest recorded religious persecutions in Western history.
And this is where his worship gets profound. The Dionysian mysteries, the secret rituals that initiates underwent, weren't about getting drunk and losing control. They were about facing your shadow, your chaos, your wildness in a sacred container where it could transform you rather than destroy you. Initiates would fast, they'd meditate, they'd drink a sacred potion that may have been psychoactive, and they'd undergo experiences designed to shatter their normal consciousness. They'd face their deepest fears, their repressed desires, the parts of themselves they'd been taught to hide, and they'd come out the other side changed, not because they'd gained some new knowledge, but because they'd remembered something ancient, that they were bigger, wilder, more complex than the narrow role society had assigned them. This is what modern psychology is slowly rediscovering, that healing often requires dissolution first, that you can't integrate your shadow by ignoring it, by maintaining rigid control, by pretending the chaos doesn't exist. You have to turn toward it, to enter it consciously, in contexts that are safe and sacred. This is what psychedelic therapy is rediscovering. This is what trauma therapy knows. You have to go through the breakdown to reach the breakthrough. You have to let yourself fall apart, at least a little, to be put back together in a truer form. And maybe that's what we need most right now. Not more control, not more optimization, not more strategies for managing ourselves like we're machines that need tuning. Maybe we need what Dionysus offered: permission to be messy, to be contradictory, to contain multitudes. Permission to cry at movies and laugh at inappropriate times, and dance badly and feel things deeply without immediately trying to fix or analyze or optimize those feelings. Permission to be human in all its chaotic glory. But here's the warning embedded in the myth: you can't control when and how the chaos comes. Pentheus tried to ban Dionysus from his city to keep everything orderly and rational, and he ended up torn apart by his own mother. The chaos will come. The only question is whether it comes as transformation or destruction, whether you make space for it in your life, create rituals and practices that honor it, or whether you suppress it until it erupts in ways you can't control. The Greeks gave us a model for this. They set aside specific times, specific spaces where chaos was not just permitted, but sacred, where the normal rules were suspended, where you could lose yourself and find yourself in the same moment. And then, when the festival ended, you returned to normal life, but transformed. You brought something back with you, a memory of wildness, a reminder that you're more than your job, your responsibilities, your carefully curated identity. You're also a body that moves, a heart that feels, a spirit that yearns for something more than mere survival or success. We've lost this. We've tried to make every moment productive, every experience meaningful, every emotion manageable. We've turned everything into content, into performance, into something to be optimized. We've forgotten how to be irrational, how to be swept away, how to surrender to experiences that we can't control or commodify or turn into personal brand building. And we're dying from it. Maybe not physically, but in all the ways that matter. We're dying from the loneliness of living inside our heads. We're dying from the exhaustion of constant. But here's what's fascinating. It didn't work. The worship continued underground, in secret, precisely because it offered something people needed desperately. In the rigid hierarchical structure of Roman society, where every person had their assigned place, where dignity was everything and losing control was the ultimate shame, Dionysus offered release. Not rebellion exactly, but relief. The chance to be fully yourself, fully embodied, fully alive, even if only for a night. The cult eventually resurfaced in modified, more acceptable forms, but the impulse never died. Because Dionysus isn't really a being you can worship or ban. He's a force, an energy that exists in human nature itself. He's the part of you that wants to dance when you hear music you love, the part that laughs until you cry, the part that falls in love recklessly, the part that creates art not for profit or recognition, but because something inside you demands expression. The part that knows, deep down, that control is an illusion, and that the most alive you've ever felt was probably when you lost yourself completely in something, a moment, a person, an experience that overwhelmed your carefully maintained boundaries. And here's where Dionysus becomes relevant to us, right now, today, in ways that might make you uncomfortable. Because we live in a culture that's forgotten everything he tried to teach. We've become a civilization of Pentheus, convinced that we can optimize ourselves into perfection, that we can control every variable, manage every emotion, productivity hack our way to happiness. We track our sleep, our steps, our calories, our screen time. We medicate away anxiety and sadness as if they're glitches in the system rather than fundamental parts of human experience. We've declared war on chaos in every form. And look where it's gotten us. Rates of depression and anxiety higher than ever recorded, an epidemic of loneliness despite being more connected than any generation in history. People who can't stop working, can't stop optimizing, can't stop performing their curated identities on social media, can't remember the last time they felt genuinely spontaneous or free. We've created lives of such rigid control, such constant self-surveillance, that we've lost touch with the very thing that makes us human, our wildness. Dionysus would recognize what we've done. We've tried to Apollo ourselves into perfection, and we're suffering for it. Because you can't eliminate chaos from human life, you can only choose how it manifests. Either you create space for it, controlled spaces like the Dionysian festivals where people could lose themselves safely, communally, in ways that were understood and integrated back into normal life, or the chaos erupts in destructive ways, in addiction, in violence, in breakdowns, in the quiet, desperate feeling that your life isn't really yours, that you're just performing a role someone else wrote for you. The Greeks knew this. They didn't see Dionysian ecstasy as a problem to be solved, but as a need to be honored. They understood that humans aren't meant to be in control all the time, that we need release, that we need experiences that overwhelm us, that shatter our carefully maintained identities and remind us we're alive. Not just alive in the biological sense, but alive in the wild, unpredictable, unmanageable sense. Alive in the way you feel when you're caught in a rainstorm and you stop trying to stay dry and just let yourself get soaked. Alive in the way you feel when you laugh so hard you forget to be self-conscious. Alive in the way you feel when you're dancing and you stop thinking about how you look and just move. But Dionysus wasn't just about intoxication or loss of control. That's the simplification, the thing we get wrong. He was about something deeper, about disillusion and rebirth, about dying to who you think you should be so you can become who you actually are. Every myth about him involves some form of death and resurrection. He was torn apart and pieced back together. He descended into the underworld to rescue his mother and bring her to Olympus. His followers ritually enacted his death and rebirth in their mysteries, because transformation requires death. Not physical death necessarily, but ego death. The death of the fixed idea you have about yourself, the death of the person you've been pretending to be.
Self-management. We're dying from the quiet desperation of lives that look successful from the outside, but feel hollow from within. Dionysus offers an alternative, not a solution because he's not about solutions, he's about questions. What would your life look like if you stopped trying to control everything? What would you create if you weren't afraid of being messy or imperfect? Who would you become if you let yourself fall apart, knowing you'd be put back together, maybe in a different shape, but a truer one? What would it feel like to be fully embodied, fully present, fully alive, even if only for a moment? These aren't comfortable questions. Dionysus never was comfortable. He was the god who made people uneasy, who challenged every boundary, who reminded civilized society that civilization is a thin veneer over something much older and wilder. But maybe that unease is exactly what we need. Maybe we've gotten too comfortable, too controlled, too convinced that we can manage our way to happiness. Maybe we need to remember that we're not machines to be optimized, but mysteries to be lived. In the end, Dionysus wasn't just the god of wine or madness or theater. He was the god of transformation itself, of the space between things, the moment when caterpillar becomes butterfly, when solid becomes liquid, when one song fades and another begins. He was the god of thresholds, of becoming, of the terrifying and exhilarating possibility that you are not fixed, that you can change, that the person you are today doesn't have to be the person you are tomorrow, that you can die to old versions of yourself and be reborn. And maybe that's his final gift to us, not a prescription for how to live, but a reminder that we're always in the process of becoming, that every ending is a beginning, that every death, literal or metaphorical, is also a birth, that chaos isn't something to be feared, but something to be embraced, consciously, carefully, but embraced nonetheless. Because on the other side of chaos is creation. On the other side of dissolution is new form. On the other side of letting go is finding what was yours all along. The Greeks knew this. They gave Dionysus a place at Olympus not despite his wildness, but because of it. They understood that a complete life requires both order and chaos, both Apollo's light and Dionysus's darkness, both the part of you that plans and builds and maintains, and the part that destroys and dances and transforms. You need both. And right now, in this moment of history, maybe we need Dionysus more than ever.
Not to abandon order entirely, but to remember what we've forgotten, that we're alive, that we're wild, that we're here to experience this strange, beautiful, terrible existence in all its fullness, not to manage it from a safe distance, but to dive in completely, to be torn apart and remade, to lose ourselves and find ourselves, to die 1,000 little deaths and be reborn each time into something truer. So here's the question Dionysus leaves us with. What are you holding on to that needs to die? What version of yourself have you outgrown but are too afraid to release? What chaos are you suppressing that, if you faced it consciously, might transform you? And what would it mean to honor both the order and the wildness inside you, to create a life that has space for both, to stop trying to be perfect and start trying to be whole? The God torn apart in infancy, the God who died and was resurrected, the God who wandered the earth mad and learned to make his madness sacred, he's not offering you answers, he's offering you a mirror. And in that mirror, if you look long enough, you might see not who you think you should be, but who you actually are. Chaos and order, light and shadow, human and divine, forever becoming, forever transforming, forever dancing between death and rebirth, forever, impossibly, magnificently alive.